the article of Mother Nature and Marble Men, and it's by Brittany Anderson. Landscape, and the first term I'm going to talk about is a taxonomic term of landscape, and that pretty much came from European art history, and it refers to a genre of painterly practice that gathered monument and prestige in the 17th and 18th century. The second term is aristocrat classical tradition painting, and that refers to landscape where fields of noble action and carefully cultivated gardens suited to house gods and heroes. And the third term, the century of the merchant, is a natural landscape and emerged to celebrate property ownership of merchant ships, windmills, waterways, farmers, and real estate. And then going on to the and landscape. And for my first bullet point, I talk about how the quality of early genre painting with accuracy that reflected the increased prestige and achievement of empirical science and offspring technology. And the second term, I'm referring to landscape in an English term, and it is specifically to Dutch paintings and only later denoted the border idea of viewing or prospects. Noble, picturesque, sublime, or mundane. And those, I talk about how it's selected and constructed text, while the formal choices of what has been included or excluded have been focus of most art historical criticisms to date. The historical and social significance of those choices has rarely been addressed or even intentionally avoided. And then my second bullet point, I talk about how the circulation graphic illustration significance more than generic places idealized by Norman Rockwell. It also notes a semi-rural gold age in the psychological center from which a ruling middle-class minority draws its symbolic identity in nationalist context. Different forms continued cultural dominance. I put portions of the national population as urban natives and refugees such as blacks, Latinos, queers, and Jews find no positive reflection, but instead repression. And then the next term on this slide, I found information from the late 19th century in the U.S. after the Indian problem had been brutally solved and the frontier ceased to exist. A veritable cult of wild natural flourished, having undergone several evolutionary phases since the contentments discovered by white Europeans, characterized by red blood pioneer life that had become basically obsolete. And then is my first bullet point, and basically I just talk about the antidote to unhealthy urban life. And then the second point for this one, I had an increase in a middle-class tourist market, first by railroads and later by automobile interests. And in the same spirit, the Acradian nature in cities through institutions of landscape such as parks, nearby forests, preserves reflected an elite activated taste for nature and the conviction that such garden spots could evaluate the aspiration and manners of immigration and workers who use them. These programs of wilderness areas began to be claimed and named refuge of timeless order in changing the world. One of them I found was God's gift to the American people, preserved as a legacy of future generations. Um, Religious Overture. I found Kenneth Erickson pointed out that the landscapes were still and are truly ceremonial in nature and requiring both code of a personal conduct of users, so rules and regulations, as well as a ritualist expression of devotion made of certain holidays or um, accomplishments to take a snapshot of nature. And then in 1908, 69 tourists went to worship in the parks, but 20 years later, that number rose to 3 million. And then in the 1920s, the general the federal government published a popular national park portfolios that prepared the general public for its first views of the Yellowstone and Yosemite National Park. Landscape divisions engineered the wilderness to accommodate automobile transportation, and then also in that year, Western movies were established, or was considered an established genre, and succeeded as no form in masculinity. The Western landscape became a winning marketing strategy for everything. The Western landscape has become complex. And then liberal view, it represents the romantic dream of pure, unsoiled wilderness communion with nature and can transpire without technological meditation and a dream. And then J.B. Jackson, he's the one I did my evaluation or my further investigation on as I was doing this presentation, but he actually pointed out we can have contact with nature on a tight and highly structural schedule, such as holidays and weekends, which is not determined by seasons but by routines of urban work. And then leading on to the next slide, I talk more about him. But the picture on the side is actually pictures of his magazine he illustrated. Into J.B. Jackson. And I found that he started an illustration magazine to inspire Americans to write the kind of local human geography he had discovered in France during the war. And then in spring in 1951, he launched Landscaping magazine, published 3 times a year, and was written for general public, so it wasn't just written for geographers. His magazine was later translated into French, German, Spanish, and Italian. And then in 1957, Berkeley, the college in California, invited him to speak amongst them, and I believe they may have awarded him too. I'm not 100% sure on that. But I do know he went to speak at Berkeley. Aesthetic, I'm not sure how to pronounce that word. But pretty much it was developed from the School of Straight Photography and pioneered by Paul Strand and Alfred Stieglitz in the years of the First World War. And it was borrowed from symbolism as forms of nature. I found it was actually started by Edward Watson and was carried out by Adams Ansel Adams during the mid-century. Adams' consistent interpretation of American landscape as a primordial Eden was well suited to the conservation political climate of the 40s and 50s. And then Minor White, the notion was revealing its reborn manifest destiny as the Cold War leader and the Cold War leader of the free world. And then Adams also had some of his pictures posted in a popular magazine from the Sierra Club. And then Sarkowski, I believe is how you say it, was an influential teacher and editor of Aperture in the 50s and 60s. And then, but in the 1970s, both Adams and White of their followers institute an expression where central ideas and scholarly legacy is more evident in the 1981. And I believe, and then it goes on to talk about how before he published, before photography, another case where landscape called Sam years before photography was published, he published American Landscape, a catalog of images from a permanent collection. And then the Robert Adamson case discovered of the market generates its own feedback loop to the individual photographers who then accept its terms as sufficient to define in its practice. And Ailes' intention is to undercut by conclusion of power, and such as hydroelectric dams that do not stir the same passionate fears. And then Lisa Elwins uses photography of TMI in very constructed content, wittily appropriately the popular seasonal calendar as a vehicle for her series considered visual for her vision. Women and different ideas have been debunked by feminists and anthropologists and scientists, and the simplistic appeals to bioevolutionary explanation for sex differences that hype the popular media. And then looking outside, biased males and females seem more productive in fields such as cultural geography, urban planning, landscape architect, and the environmental viewed as an Italian of social symbols and contradictions. Because I believe that landscape has played a big part in photography, but also our world. Without landscape, we wouldn't have movies, photos, or paintings of it at all, and the paintings would be mostly of families, self-portraits, or just people portraits in general. We wouldn't think to do landscape paintings at all. Up in the article have influenced our photography today. I think the thing that stands out to me is the Western movies and the landscape that influenced those movies and brought forth Western movies and photography. .amb.org, of Mother Nature and the Marble Men, and Google Images.